The closing arguments in the Derek Chauvin case show definitively that one side is basing their whole case in emotion, while the other is based in the law. I'm Andrew Esquire, and this is The Legal Mindset, where we help give you an unfair advantage. Now, the Derek Chauvin case seems like it's been going on forever. It took so long for jury selection, for all those prosecution witnesses, and for the defense's case to finally wrap up. And after that, we had the redirects, the extra crosses, the rebuttal from the prosecution, and we also had motions from the defense. They tried to get mistrials at any opportunity, and they also tried to get Derek Chauvin acquitted by the judge. All of that was shot down. And we already did videos on what our prediction would be for the outcome of the case, as well as some mistakes that Judge Peter Cahill made during the case. But today, we're just going to focus on the closing arguments and some important things that you really need to focus on when you're thinking about the closing arguments. The closing arguments are arguably the most important part of a case. They allow a lot of leeway for the prosecutor, for the defense to kind of say what they want to say. They can pretty much go a little bit wild, be a little bit assertive. And that's something that every lawyer should do. Whether you're a prosecutor or a defender, you have a duty to advocate for your client, right? So in the case of the state, they have a duty to advocate for the prosecution, to say, hey, that person's guilty, and make it very convincing that that person is guilty, in this case, Derek Chauvin. While the defense has a duty to give Derek Chauvin a fair and full defense, to be a zealous advocate for that client. And I think both of those lawyers did that. But the key here is how they did that. What type of case did they use? I mean, there's lots of different strategies somebody can use. I mean, a basic one, which was relied on by the defense, it was one of the things the defense pointed to, not the only thing, and we'll get back to that, is reasonable doubt. So let's take a moment just to talk about reasonable doubt and what the beyond a reasonable doubt standard is. Well, in criminal court, when you're talking about crimes, you're living by a beyond the reasonable doubt standard. What is beyond a reasonable doubt? Beyond a reasonable doubt is any doubt that a reasonable, normal, prudent person might have. So you're going to throw out crazy and frivolous possibilities. So for example, they brought up aliens, right? So aliens abducting somebody, possessing somebody. Yes, it's kind of possible. I mean, there could be aliens out there. They could possess somebody. They could come down from the sky and make you do something with a mind control beam. Yeah, it's within the realm of possibility, but it's not reasonable. It's kind of fictional and a little bit crazy. It's also possible that there were other factors at work that might have a low probability of happening, like let's say some weird radio frequencies that were messing with everybody's head and making them more aggressive. Yeah, it's possible, but that's not what a reasonable person can rely on. They have to look at the facts, they have to look at the evidence and say, hey, is there any reasonable doubt here? And it's supposed to be a very low standard. And when I say low, I mean it's supposed to be very easy for the defense to win because of the presumption of innocence. And I think this is something that's lost in this case because from the get-go, from the jump, there's been an assumption of guilt. And why is it that there's an issue here? Well, it's an issue because of the 9-minute and 29-second video, the video that everybody saw. And because everybody saw that video, and that's a huge issue we're going to talk about today, there's a presumption of guilt because social media has already judged them. News media, BLM, it decided this case long before it ever went to trial, long before we saw any other facts of this case. And that's the huge issue, is that we need to trust our judicial system. We need to trust our legal system to function and allow those jurors to do what they're going to do. Because after they've seen all of the evidence, they're supposed to come to the decision. It's not supposed to be something that the court of public opinion comes out and decides. It's something that the individual jurors, taking into account everything, decide. Here's the problem though. The problem is that the prosecution seems, in their closing argument, to be based solely on emotion. In fact, one of the huge issues, one of the huge buttons that the prosecution pressed again and again was the 9-minute and 29-second video. They just hammered that number into people's heads. And they said, look, rely on what you saw in that video, in that moment. Rely on it before trial. They said, when you first saw that video, what are they hinting at? They're hinting at the fact that people saw it on social media. And what did they say? Go with your gut. Go with your emotions. Go with what you felt the first time. And once again, this flies in the face of the law. That's not what a prosecutor is supposed to say. They're supposed to say, look, it met the elements of the crime. Everything checks out. What we presented today conclusively proves it. But that's not what they said. What they said was rely on the video evidence. Rely on your feelings, and that will guide you through to the correct answer. And that's extremely problematic when it comes to criminal punishment. We shouldn't be guided by feelings. We should be guided by the law. And largely that's what the defense did bring up. And granted, there were some deficiencies with the defense's argument. There are issues they could have raised, which they did not raise, problems that were brought up that could have been brought up or not. But I'm not Nelson. I'm not Chauvin's defense attorney, and I'm not going to second guess why he made his decisions. What I am going to give him credit for is relying on the law. He explained it correctly. It's a totality of the circumstances when it comes to criminal law. You have to look at everything. You can't just look at 9 minutes and 29 seconds. You have to look at the rest of the video. And he did that. He played video where you saw George Floyd struggling, fighting, talking, yelling, screaming. I mean, those are big facts that you need to consider. Now, it's totally fair if the jury considers those and still comes out to a decision. But they have to consider them. And what Nelson was pushing was looking at all of the factors, looking at the crowd, looking at the fact that George Floyd was fighting back, that he was kicking, that he was moving, that he was yelling, that he was screaming, that clearly he could breathe because he could talk and was yelling constantly. And let's not forget the drugs. The drugs are a huge issue in this case. Drugs affect anyone, not just people that day, but anybody is affected by those drugs, and also pre-existing conditions. I mean, look, if you've got a bad heart, you should not be on any type of drug, whether it's an upper, a downer, or a sideways drug. You shouldn't be doing it because it puts you at risk of death. I mean, there are people dying every day from doing crazy drugs out there. And once again, if you're buying them off the street, you never know what you're getting. You never know what it's laced with. You never know if it's pure. You have no idea. And that was a huge risk for a person like George Floyd. And that's not to say that Chauvin was in the right, that he did everything he should have done. That's not what it's saying at all. But that's also not what's at issue here. What's at issue here was whether the use of force was authorized and whether the unlawful use of force caused George Floyd's death. And that is brought into question by all the evidence that was presented. And Nelson did a good job of that, good job of presenting that reasonable doubt. But, as was pointed out immediately after the closing statements, there are concerns about what's going on outside of Minneapolis. I mean, you've seen the protests that have already started. There's already issues with children going to school. They've already said, hey, we're going to have the children remote school for a while, just like they did during COVID, just in case of riots and other situations that might erupt after this case breaks out. We've also seen Congressman Maxine Waters, who was called out specifically by Judge Peter Cahill and by defense attorney Nelson because she had inflammatory remarks. In fact, Judge Peter Cahill had specific harsh words for Ms. Waters that she should just keep it to herself and trust the judicial system because they're doing their job. They're processing the information. And it's almost impossible for jurors to go day to day and not see things changing, and not when they're driving home see barricades being put up, preparations for riots. I mean, these are things that could affect a juror, and they haven't been sequestered. And that's something that we've talked about on this channel, and they talked about right after closing arguments. They brought up those issues. And it's been a crazy trial, but I think both of the sides put forward their strongest argument. It just so happens that the prosecution's strongest argument was an emotional one. It was an appeal to gut instinct, to just quick judgment, while the defense's argument is based on the foundation of reasonable doubt and the presumption of innocence that are not only enshrined in our law, but enshrined in our Constitution and should be fundamental beliefs for every American. If you want to know more about the charges and our particular prediction, check out my video, Is It Murder?